The Andromeda Mining Consortium had always prided itself on maintaining the most sophisticated security protocols in known space. After all, when you're strip mining asteroids worth more than entire planetary economies, you tend to attract the sort of attention that requires serious firepower to discourage. Their defense systems could allegedly vaporize a cruiser before its captain finished saying, "This is a robbery," and their security forces trained on worlds where gravity could crush a lesser being's spine just by existing, which made it all the more embarrassing that something was systematically dismantling their operations with what could only be described as theatrical flair. The first incident occurred at mining platform Delta 7, a floating fortress designed to extract precious metals from the corpses of dead stars. The platform housed 300 Zephyrian workers, beings whose natural exoskeletons could deflect small arms fire, and whose 4 arms made them exceptionally efficient at operating complex machinery. They also maintained a garrison of 20 shock troopers, elite soldiers whose combat prowess was legendary across 17 sectors. The creature killed them all in approximately 14 minutes. Security footage showed something that defied conventional categorization. Bipedal, roughly humanoid in shape, but standing nearly 3 meters tall, with proportions that suggested someone had taken a standard, sapient template and fed it nothing but violence and protein supplements for several decades. Its hide appeared to be some sort of biometallic composite that absorbed energy weapon discharge like a particularly hungry sponge, while its limbs moved with the sort of fluid precision that made seasoned warriors weep quietly into their ration packs. The Zephyrians had opened fire the moment it breached their outer hull, which was their first mistake. Their second mistake was assuming that overwhelming firepower would solve a problem that clearly required a more nuanced approach, like running away very, very quickly. Plasma bolts that could melt through starship armor merely caused the creature to pause, cock its head with what seemed like mild curiosity, and then proceed to demonstrate why evolution had equipped it with retractable claws the size of mining picks. The shock troopers managed to last slightly longer, primarily because they had enough sense to take cover behind blast barriers rated to withstand direct hits from orbital bombardment. The creature simply punched through the barriers. Platform Delta 7's distress beacon lasted exactly long enough to transmit the phrase, "Unknown hostile, request immediate," before cutting to static that would haunt communications officers' dreams for months to come. The Voltaic Energy Consortium's response team arrived 6 hours later, confident that whatever had overwhelmed a mining platform couldn't possibly stand against their cutting-edge weaponry. The Voltaics had built their entire civilization around the mastery of directed energy, developing weapons that could theoretically punch holes through small moons if properly calibrated. Their battlesuits channeled raw stellar power, their ships bristled with particle cannons, and their soldiers trained in combat techniques that involved literally throwing lightning at their enemies. The creature was waiting for them. What followed could generously be described as an educational demonstration in the futility of relying too heavily on energy-based combat doctrines. The Voltai strike team unleashed enough firepower to glass a continent, watching in growing horror as their target not only remained standing, but appeared to be absorbing their attacks. Worse, it seemed to be learning from each successive barrage, adapting its movements to anticipate their firing patterns with disturbing accuracy. By the time the survivors retreated, and there were precious few of those, they'd brought back reports that made even the most hardened military analysts question their career choices. The creature didn't just resist their weapons, it appeared to derive some form of sustenance from energy attacks, growing visibly stronger as the battle progressed. The crystalline hegemony's siege engineers approached the problem with characteristic methodical precision. If energy weapons proved ineffective, they would simply drop several tons of kinetic ordnance from orbit and solve the problem through the application of basic physics. Their bombardment ships could crack planetary crusts, their guided projectiles moved at significant fractions of light speed, and their targeting computers could thread a needle from 3-star systems away. The creature survived a direct orbital strike that left a crater visible from space, then proceeded to tear apart their orbital platform with weapons it had apparently fashioned from the wreckage of previous encounters. The engineering corps later estimated that the creature had somehow managed to create a functional particle accelerator using nothing but debris and what appeared to be several hundred meters of repurposed mining cable. By the time Research Station Theta Prime received word that they were next on the creature's apparent list of social calls, panic had evolved into something approaching philosophical resignation. The station housed representatives from 12 different species, all of whom possessed military traditions stretching back millennia and weapons technologies that represented the pinnacle of their respective civilizations' achievements, none of which seemed particularly relevant when faced with something that treated their most advanced armaments as appetizers. Station Commander Vexguy, a veteran of the Tholian border wars whose tactical acumen was legendary even among species that considered warfare an art form, called an emergency meeting to discuss their options. The assembled officers represented some of the finest military minds in known space, beings whose strategic brilliance had won conflicts that historians would study for generations. They spent 4 hours debating various tactical approaches before unanimously agreeing that they were, in technical military parlance, completely screwed. "Perhaps we should consider evacuation," suggested Chief Security Officer Morentok, whose species had survived 3 separate extinction events through the time-honored strategy of running away from things that wanted to kill them. "Evacuation protocols require 6 hours minimum," Vexguy replied, gesturing at the tactical display showing the creature's projected course. "Current estimates put its arrival at approximately 90 minutes. The assembled officers contemplated this timeline with the sort of stoic acceptance typically reserved for condemned prisoners reviewing their execution schedules. It was at this moment of collective despair that Station Communications Officer Plixin announced that they had received a docking request from an unscheduled vessel. The ship identified itself as an independent transport carrying a single passenger who claimed to be responding to their distress beacon. The vessel's registration indicated human origin. This information was met with the sort of respectful silence usually reserved for moments when someone has just announced that they've discovered a cure for entropy or that the cafeteria would be serving something other than reconstituted protein paste for dinner. "A human," Vexguy repeated, as if saying the words more clearly might somehow make them mean something different. "Yes, sir. Single occupant requesting permission to dock at Bay 7. The assembled officers exchanged glances that conveyed volumes about their collective opinion of human military capabilities. Humans had been part of galactic civilization for barely 2 centuries, which in cosmic terms made them essentially infants, playing with toys they didn't fully understand. Their technology was primitive, their weapons outdated, and their tactical doctrines appeared to have been developed by beings who considered charge directly at the enemy while screaming legitimate military strategy. On the other hand, they were about to be visited by something that had proven capable of treating the galaxy's finest military forces as recreational activities. "Grant docking permission," Vexguy decided. At this point, even a human couldn't possibly make our situation any worse. This statement would later be remembered as one of the most spectacularly incorrect predictions in recorded military history. The docking bay's atmospheric processors wheezed in protest as they struggled to accommodate yet another species' respiratory requirements. Station Theta Prime's environmental systems had been designed with the optimistic assumption that most visitors would possess the courtesy to breathe something resembling standard atmospheric mixtures, rather than the exotic chemical cocktails that various species insisted upon for survival. The human who emerged from the transport's cramped airlock looked like someone had consulted a manual titled "How to Disappoint Military Personnel in 3 Easy Steps," and followed the instructions with religious devotion. Average height for their species, which meant they stood roughly at shoulder level to most of the station's crew. Their equipment appeared to have been assembled by someone who had heard descriptions of modern warfare second-hand and decided to improvise accordingly. The weapon holstered at their side was particularly fascinating in its apparent obsolescence. Some sort of chemical perbuted projectile launcher that belonged in the same historical category as stone axes and diplomatic immunity. The human's armor, if the collection of reinforced fabric and ceramic plates could be dignified with such a term, looked like it had been designed by beings who considered adequate protection synonymous with better than nothing. Lieutenant Krasvol of station security performed the mandatory bioscan with the expression of someone discovering that their sophisticated detection equipment had just identified a particularly unremarkable houseplant. Single organism, carbon-based, approximately 70 kilograms of what I can only assume is mostly optimism and poorly distributed muscle mass. The scan results projected holographically above his workstation told a story that would have been amusing if it weren't so pathetic. No energy shielding, no genetic modifications, no cybernetic enhancements, no neural implants, and a cardiovascular system that suggested this particular human had never encountered a gymnasium or possibly even a steep flight of stairs. "Threat assessment?" inquired Commander Vexguy, though his tone suggested he was asking purely for the sake of completeness rather than any genuine concern about their visitor's combat potential. "I've seen more dangerous specimens in the station's botanical gardens," Krasvol replied. "Their primary weapon appears to fire solid projectiles using chemical combustion, which is quaint, like bringing a pointed stick to a stellar engineering conference." The human, either oblivious to this professional assessment or possessed of remarkable emotional resilience, approached the security checkpoint with the sort of casual confidence typically exhibited by tourists visiting historical monuments. "Afternoon, folks. Heard you might be having some trouble with uninvited guests." Dr. Tisran, the station's chief xenobiologist, leaned forward with the interest of someone observing a particularly intriguing evolutionary dead end. "Fascinating. The human appears to be exhibiting what their species calls confidence, despite possessing none of the physiological or technological advantages typically associated with such behavior." "Maybe they don't understand the situation," suggested Chief Engineer Volcom, whose species had built their entire civilization around the principle that ignorance was the most dangerous force in the universe. "Should we explain exactly how many different ways they're about to die?" Commander Vexguy decided that diplomatic courtesy required at least attempting to educate their doomed visitor. "The hostile entity has demonstrated complete immunity to directed energy weapons, kinetic bombardment, and tactical nuclear deployment. It possesses physical capabilities that exceed anything in our database and appears to derive sustenance from conventional military engagement." The human nodded, as if this information was merely interesting rather than absolutely terrifying. "Sounds like it's been having a rough time. How long since it started this tour of local facilities?" "Approximately 6 standard months," Vexguy replied, wondering if humans possessed some sort of psychological defense mechanism that prevented them from processing existential dread. "6 months of fighting everything it encounters," the human mused, examining their fingernails with the sort of casual attention typically reserved for contemplating lunch options. "Must be exhausting. Anyone tried talking to it?" The assembled officers exchanged glances that conveyed several libraries worth of tactical doctrine and military philosophy, all of which could be summarized as, "You don't negotiate with things that can punch through starship hulls." "The entity has not demonstrated any interest in communication," Dr. Tisran explained with scholarly patience. "Its behavior pattern suggests a purely predatory response to contact with other sapient life forms." "Ha!" the human said, as if this represented merely a minor technical challenge rather than an insurmountable obstacle to continued existence. "Well, every problem has a solution. Just need to find the right approach." 18 minutes later, the station's proximity alarms began their familiar song of impending doom. Long-range sensors had detected something approaching at velocities that suggested either advanced propulsion technology or a fundamental misunderstanding of how physics was supposed to work. The object's trajectory indicated it had launched itself from the debris field of mining platform Epsilon 9, apparently using the wreckage as an improvised catapult. "All personnel to emergency stations," Commander Vexguy announced, his voice carrying the weary resignation of someone who had run out of innovative ways to say goodbye. "Hostile contact imminent. Prepare defensive positions and, well, prepare for whatever feels appropriate under the circumstances." The human finished examining the station's tactical displays with the sort of professional interest typically shown by contractors reviewing blueprints. "Nice setup you've got here. Very thorough. Lots of overlapping fields of fire, redundant power systems, multiple fallback positions. They paused thoughtfully. Shame it won't make any difference. This observation was delivered with such casual certainty that it took several seconds for the implications to register with the listening officers. You seem remarkably calm for someone about to face certain death, noted Dr. Tisran, her scientific curiosity overriding her survival instincts. Death's always certain, the human replied, checking their weapons' ammunition with practiced efficiency. It's the timing that varies. Besides, certain's just another word for haven't considered all the variables yet. The station's hull shuddered as something very large made contact with their outer defensive perimeter. Emergency lighting cast shifting shadows through corridors designed to withstand military assault, while the creature began its systematic process of converting sophisticated defensive systems into expensive debris. Automated turrets that could track and eliminate incoming missiles fired continuously for approximately 30 seconds before falling silent. Blast barriers rated to withstand direct hits from orbital bombardment held their positions for nearly 2 minutes before being repurposed as abstract art installations. The creature's progress through the station's outer defenses could be monitored by the steady progression of system failures, each one marking another milestone in their inevitable defeat. Hull breach in Section 12, reported the tactical officer with professional calm that bordered on the supernatural. Defensive Grid 7 is, well, it's no longer geometrically recognizable as a defensive grid. The human began walking toward the source of the disturbance, with the measured pace of someone heading to a routine appointment rather than a presumably fatal encounter. Their movement lacked the urgent haste that characterized everyone else's current activities, suggesting either remarkable courage or a complete failure to understand the nature of their situation. "Where exactly are you going?" asked Chief Security Officer Mrentok, whose species had survived 4 separate galactic conflicts through the time-tested strategy of running away from dangerous situations as quickly as possible. "To work," the human replied simply. "Someone needs to handle this situation, and apparently that someone is me." The creature's advance through the station followed a pattern of overwhelming efficiency, punctuated by moments of almost artistic destruction. It seemed to take particular interest in examining sophisticated technology before reducing it to component elements, as if conducting some sort of destructive quality assessment of galactic engineering standards. Emergency evacuation protocols moved civilian personnel toward the escape pods, though current calculations suggested that the creature would reach the evacuation bays approximately 6 minutes before the pods could achieve minimum safe distance. The mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly theoretical with each passing moment. It was during the evacuation process that the creature encountered a mixed group of research staff and maintenance workers who had been unable to reach their assigned emergency stations. The group included several younglings from different species, their natural curiosity about the universe unfortunately timed to coincide with a demonstration of its more hostile aspects. The creature paused in its advance, studying this collection of non-combatants with what might have been interest, or possibly hunger. The distinction was difficult to determine from its expressions. The civilians held perfectly still, operating under the optimistic theory that remaining motionless might somehow render them invisible to something that had just finished converting a military checkpoint into modern sculpture. For several eternal seconds, the outcome balanced on the edge of probability. The creature seemed to be conducting some sort of internal calculation, weighing variables that remained opaque to external observation. It was precisely at this moment of suspended judgment that footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Measured, unhurried footsteps that belonged to someone apparently unconcerned with the mathematical certainty of their own demise. The human appeared around the corner, walking toward the creature with the sort of deliberate pace typically associated with casual observation rather than suicidal intervention. Their weapon remained holstered. Their posture suggested mild professional interest rather than combat readiness, and their general demeanor indicated someone approaching a mildly complex technical problem rather than an unstoppable engine of destruction. Every being present, aliens, civilians, monitoring station personnel, and quite possibly the creature itself, expected the next few seconds to provide a brief but educational demonstration of human fragility under extreme stress. Instead, something entirely unprecedented occurred. The creature turned away from the civilians, focused its complete attention on this new arrival, and for the first time since its rampage began, it stopped moving entirely. What followed could only be described as the most politely conducted standoff in the recorded history of interstellar violence. The creature and the human regarded each other across 20 meters of corridor with the sort of measured assessment typically reserved for chess masters contemplating their opening moves, or perhaps two predators trying to determine which one was actually at the top of the food chain. The human broke the silence first, which was either commendable bravery or spectacular stupidity. "You've been busy," they observed, gesturing at the artistic arrangement of what had previously been a defensive turret emplacement. "Very thorough work. Professional quality destruction." The creature tilted its head, a gesture that might have been curiosity if performed by something less capable of converting living beings into abstract art. Its response came in the form of a low rumble that seemed to originate from somewhere deep within its chest cavity, a sound that contained harmonics suggesting both vocal cords and possibly a small fusion reactor. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in discussing alternative career paths?" the human continued, as if conducting a routine employment counseling session rather than attempting to negotiate with something that had recently redefined the concept of military superiority. "Seems like you might be overqualified for the whole terrifying, unstoppable monster position." Dr. Tisran, monitoring the situation from a presumably safe distance through security feeds, made rapid notes on her datapad. "Remarkable. The human appears to be attempting diplomatic engagement with an entity that has demonstrated zero interest in communication with any previous contact." "The human appears to be insane," corrected Chief Engineer Volcom, whose species had developed 17 different words for various types of tactical stupidity. The creature's response to this conversational gambit was to produce what could generously be described as a weapon, though weapon implied a level of design sophistication that didn't quite capture the elegant brutality of the device that materialized in its appendages. The object appeared to be constructed from salvaged components of previously destroyed military equipment, somehow forge-welded into a configuration that suggested both advanced engineering principles and a complete disregard for conventional safety protocols. "Ah," the human said, noting this development with the sort of mild interest typically reserved for observing weather patterns. "I see we're moving to the more traditional negotiation methods." The creature raised its improvised armament with movements that flowed like liquid mercury, demonstrating the sort of practiced efficiency that came from extensive field testing on unwilling subjects. The weapon's business end began to glow with accumulated energy, suggesting that whatever it was designed to do would happen very quickly and with considerable finality. The human, in response to this escalation, drew their primitive chemical-powered firearm with the sort of casual motion typically associated with retrieving items from coat pockets. The weapon looked even more inadequate when directly compared to the creature's energy-based death machine, roughly equivalent to bringing a kitchen utensil to a stellar engineering conference. "You know," the human continued, apparently undeterred by the fundamental mismatch in their respective firepower, "I've been thinking about your situation. 6 months of constant fighting, always moving, never resting. That's got to be exhausting work." The creature fired. The energy discharge that erupted from its weapon would have been sufficient to vaporize a small building, or possibly a large building if properly focused. The blast struck the corridor wall where the human had been standing with enough force to convert several tons of military-grade composite materials into component atoms, leaving behind a crater that glowed with residual heat. The human, however, was no longer in that particular location. Instead, they had somehow relocated themselves approximately 3 meters to the left, a feat accomplished with the sort of fluid efficiency that suggested either remarkable reflexes or possibly a fundamental misunderstanding of how causality was supposed to work. Their return fire came in the form of 3 precisely placed projectiles that struck the creature center mass with impacts that sounded like someone dropping anvils on concrete. The creature examined the impact points with what might have been professional interest, noting that the primitive kinetic rounds had actually managed to penetrate its outer dermal layers, a feat that several advanced military forces had been unable to accomplish with weapons costing more than most planetary defense budgets. Interesting, the creature spoke for the first time, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested vocal cords designed by beings who considered intimidation a primary form of communication. Most of them run. Most of them haven't seen what I've seen, the human replied, ejecting spent casings and reloading with practiced efficiency. Besides, running just delays the inevitable conversation. What followed was a combat engagement that redefined several fundamental assumptions about warfare, physics, and the relationship between advanced technology and practical effectiveness. The creature moved with the sort of fluid precision that suggested years of optimization for maximum lethality, while the human demonstrated a remarkable ability to be somewhere else whenever the creature's weapons discharged. The corridor became a maze of energy blasts, kinetic projectiles, and debris as both combatants explored the tactical possibilities of their environment. The creature's attacks carved abstract sculptures from the station's infrastructure, while the humans' responses demonstrated an almost artistic appreciation for ricochet angles and improvised cover positions. "The human is actually holding their own," observed Commander Vexsky, his voice carrying the sort of stunned disbelief typically reserved for moments when the laws of physics decided to take an unscheduled vacation. "How is this possible?" "Simple kinetic weapons versus energy-based systems," Dr. Thisran replied, her scientific training finally providing a framework for understanding the impossible. The creature's defenses are optimized for absorbing directed energy. Solid projectiles represent an entirely different category of threat. The battle continued with a rhythm that suggested both participants were conducting some sort of educational exchange rather than attempting to kill each other. The creature would unleash devastating energy attacks that demonstrated its overwhelming firepower, while the human would respond with precisely placed shots that somehow found gaps in defenses that had previously seemed absolute. It was during one of these exchanges that the human's luck finally ran out. A near miss from the creature's energy weapon caught them in the blast radius, sending them tumbling across the corridor with the sort of impressive trajectory typically associated with launched projectiles rather than walking organisms. The human struck the corridor wall with sufficient force to leave a distinctly person-shaped impression in the reinforced composite, then slid to the floor with movements that suggested several important structural components had been rearranged without proper consultation with their owner. Blood, actual red blood, which seemed almost quaint compared to the exotic circulatory fluids of most galactic species, began pooling beneath the human's crumpled form. Their breathing came in shallow gasps that suggested respiratory systems operating well outside normal parameters. The creature approached with the measured pace of someone conducting a post-combat assessment, its improvised weapon still glowing with residual energy. Victory appeared to be a foregone conclusion, requiring only the application of finishing touches to complete the educational demonstration. It was at this moment that something unprecedented occurred in the creature's experience of systematic violence. The human began to cry. Not the sort of strategic vocalization that some species used as distress signals or psychological warfare, but genuine tears, accompanied by the sort of quiet sobbing that suggested emotional systems overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their capacity to process. The sound carried harmonics of pain, exhaustion, and something that might have been grief for opportunities that would never be explored. The creature stopped its advance abruptly, as if it had encountered an invisible barrier. Its weapon lowered slowly, the energy discharge fading to a dim glow that cast uncertain shadows through the damaged corridor. For several seconds it remained perfectly motionless, apparently processing information that didn't fit into its previous categories of experience. Then, in a gesture that would perplex xenopsychologists for decades to come, the creature set down its weapon and took a step backward. The human tears continued, accompanied by words spoken so quietly that the station's audio sensors barely registered them. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you. The creature's response was a sound that had never appeared in any of its previous encounters, a low keening that seemed to originate from somewhere much deeper than vocal cords, carrying harmonics of something that might have been recognition or possibly relief. For the first time since its rampage began, the unstoppable force had encountered something that made it want to stop.